Welcome back to Movie On. Today we're going to do a recap of the movie named Elegy from 2008. The movie opens with Professor David Kopesh talking on a TV interview show where the host is asking him questions about the origin of Western civilization. David is a professor of cultural studies with a very bold and brazen outlook on the world. He does not like to adhere to social codes of conduct and thinks of them as meaningless conventionalities that will only keep his manhood chastised and will keep him away from attaining true happiness in life. The host asks David if they were all descendants of the Puritans, but David doesn't agree with this. Puritans were English Protestants in the 16th and 17th century who formed a religious movement to purify mankind and stop humanity from swaying towards a way of living that was not biblical. Puritans originated from the Church of England, and their values were very conformist and rooted in tradition and family-oriented living. David is not a fan of this idea and believes in his own version of freedom and a sexually free lifestyle. He tells the host that there was another ancient colony of humans that lived 30 miles from the Plymouth colony, known as Marymount. David goes on to explain how this ancient colony of humans existed at the same time as Puritans, and this colony was much freer. He says this was the colony where anything goes was the norm, and no limit was put on anything. Whether it was fornication, imbibing, dissolution of all religion, or worshipping of imaginary gods, everything was allowed. White men and Indian men danced together around flames with no prejudice between different races. David starts talking about the leader of the Marymount colony, whose name was Thomas Morton. He was a former Puritan and led a movement of Puritan separatists and created a colony of his own where people did not have to abide by the strict and disciplined way of living taught by the Church of England and the Puritans who ran it. The interviewer refers to Thomas Morton as the Hugh Hefner of Puritans. Hugh Hefner was an American publisher who was known for being highly promiscuous and the owner of Playboy magazine. David laughs at this comparison and agrees. He quotes Thomas Morton as saying that he wanted to live a free and degenerate life. David jokes that hearing this makes him want to pack his bags and go join this colony in the past, because he likes to live like a degenerate and not restrain himself with social values or responsibilities. David goes on to share how Puritans shut down the Marymount colony, and now the Marymount colony does not exist on the map anymore. In the end, when the interviewer asks David if Puritans won and turned modern-day America into a conservative nation, David sadly agrees and states that the Puritans took away sexual happiness from men by placing restrictions on them. The conversation continues as the two continue to talk about the evolution of sexual expression in America, and both agree that in the 1960s, America started to experience sexual freedom again, and men were able to break free from the sexual restrictions of marriage and family life. Instead, men were now able to have sex whenever they wanted, with whoever they wanted. David goes on to share that he was married in the 1960s and has plenty of regrets about making that decision. The scene now cuts to the skyline of New York City, and David's voice also starts to narrate the movie. David is talking about old age and how even though he may have aged on the outside, he still feels on the inside that nothing has changed. David is standing at the window of his upscale and somberly styled New York apartment. He's standing very still and simply observing the rain. The scene now cuts to a college hallway where students holding books are walking haphazardly in each direction so they can make it to their lectures. Between these students, a striking young woman named Consuela Castillo is making her way to her own classroom. She's walking in effortless strides as a jovial yet understated sense of beauty resonates from within her. She's wearing a chic and crisp white linen blouse paired with an elongating black skirt that enhances her figure with its tight fit, but adds mystery to her shape with its unrelenting color. She starts to look slightly pensive as she comes closer and closer to her classroom. David is already writing on the board with chalk as Consuela starts to walk down the stairs of the auditorium. She takes her seat with her fellow students. She sits right in front of David, and both of them instantly match each other's gaze. Consuela opens up her notebook so she can start taking notes on what David is saying. We hear David narrating again, and he's admiring Consuela. He says he likes how she dresses, as if she works at an expensive law firm, and how she has the perfect posture, which makes her look more alert and fully realized as compared to other female students. During the class, when David notices that Consuela is too focused on taking notes, he tells her to stop and only listen so she can truly absorb what he's saying. Consuela smiles nervously and signals to him that she will stop. She's a bit flushed at being called out in front of the entire class. The scene cuts to a cocktail party at David's apartment after the test is over, and all the students have been graded. David is speaking to other female students, but his eyes are always focused on Consuela. After making some small talk with other students, he finally manages to have an alone conversation with Consuela. He refers to her as Miss Castillo. She's standing alone and looking at an ancient letter that David has framed and hung on his wall. She's amused to see that David has the original artifact of such an ancient exchange between civilizations. She smiles and tells him to call her Consuela and not be so formal because they're not in class anymore. But David remains mostly serious and somewhat pensive throughout this entire conversation because he's not making small talk. He is trying to subliminally persuade Consuela so he can have meaningless sex with her. David tells her that she has somewhat of an elegant austerity, and she tells him that she gets that from her Cuban father. After some more small talk, David opens a book and starts to show her a classical painting and tells her that she resembles this painting. His attempt is to flatter Consuela so she would have sex with him, but Consuela is not so simple-minded. While she is observing the painting, David takes a quick moment to sniff her hair. He tries to be discreet about it, but Consuela is very self-aware and she notices instantly. But she doesn't say anything about it and just smiles. David doesn't care about anything that she's telling him, and he's simply thinking of ways to get Consuela into his bed. Consuela mentions that she's loved theater all her life, and David instantly invites her to go see a Broadway play with him, and Consuela shyly agrees. The scene cuts to David playing squash with his very close friend George. George is a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet and has different values than David. George has been happily married for 20 years and likes to have a simple sex life with his wife, whereas David is the complete opposite. George understands David, and instead of criticizing him, George always gives David advice on how to be more sexually free and experience more freedom. When David mentions Consuela, George is too stunned to speak, mainly because of the age difference. Consuela is only 24 years old, but David claims that her beauty and her grace belong to a completely different time. George doesn't understand why David must go after a 24-year-old girl, so George jokes that David should get married again. George says that he can have an exciting social and sex life with his wife without having to go after young girls all the time. The scene cuts to David's bedroom. He's on his bed while a woman is on top of him. The woman is Carolyn. She was David's student 20 years ago, and since then, Carolyn and David have maintained a casual sex relationship where they see each other every now and then purely for the purpose of sex, and nothing else. After they finish, both of them lay side by side. While David is silent, Carolyn rolls over the side to light a cigarette. David tells her she should stop smoking, and Carolyn replies he's been telling her to stop smoking for 20 years, and it still hasn't worked. She's under a lot of pressure, and smoking helps her. She remembers David's class 20 years ago, and playfully claims that the class was so unbecoming that it was the sole reason why she started smoking. David starts to joke about Carolyn running her own business as a woman, and as they're both having a chat, the phone rings. David doesn't pick up the phone and tells the call to go to voicemail. On the message, it's his son. His son leaves a very deprecating message for David because David didn't pick up his call, and nor did he answer his email. David claims that it's been 35 years, but his son still hates his guts. Carolyn giggles, yet continues to smoke her cigarette. She tells David that his son hates him because he ran out on his son and left his wife in search of a more free lifestyle. Carolyn tells David that the eternal hatred from his biological son is the price to pay for liberation. David continues to complain and justify his behavior. After the play, David takes Consuela back to his apartment, where they both play piano together, and David tries to show her different aspects of his life to pique her interest, but Consuela is still not fazed. David takes her to his dark room, where he manually develops photos. He tells her he doesn't understand digital things, and still likes to do things the old-fashioned way. Consuela takes a look, but she's not impressed, nor does it pique her interest. She walks out before David, and he walks out after her, turning the red light off as he closes the door of his darkroom. There's a sense of duality in the way Consuela treats David. She is stern enough to know that she can have better than her old professor, but also kind enough to feel that maybe David does have something special to offer after all. Together, they start looking at the paintings again, and David starts to explain the composition of the paintings and what the characters of the painting mean. He's just trying to find any topic of discussion so he can keep Consuela close to him and find an opportunity to make a move on her. Consuela thinks David actually wants to talk with her about music and art, but all David wants is to have sex with her. They're sitting very close together on the sofa, and Consuela is fully immersed in the painting. Pretending that he's about to flip the page of the book, David firmly places his hand on Consuela's wrist and starts rubbing her arm up and down. Consuela is silent and still not very amused. She's simply letting David have his way so she can be clear about what his motives are. David now places his hand on Consuela's face and gently grabs her chin and pulls her forward for a kiss. Consuela still doesn't stop him, but also doesn't move forward to kiss him. David readjusts his position on the couch and now puts his second hand on the other side of Consuela's face. He slowly comes close to her and starts caressing her lips with his thumb. Consuela has closed her eyes and her head is tilted downwards. She still doesn't lean forward to kiss, and David finally has to go in and place his lips on her lips. The kiss is very brief and awkward and lasts only for a fraction of a second. The scene now cuts to Consuela standing with her back against the wall and David standing in front of her. They're in the hallway of David's apartment and the dim lighting is further enhancing the sexual tension in the room. David is shirtless while Consuela is still fully clothed. They're standing close to each other and Consuela is looking at him with eyes wide open, but she's keeping her hands to herself. David takes the initiative to touch her first. He touches her waist first with one hand, then puts both his hands around her waist and starts to pull her body closer to him. Now Consuela is finally starting to show some interest in David. She's kissing his neck as they both stand in the hallway with their bodies leaning on each other. Consuela seems to be slightly turned on now, but she's still somewhat reluctant. She slowly undoes the top of her blouse to reveal her cleavage, and then David kisses her on the lips again. This time the kiss is more intimate and long-lasting, and Consuela kisses David back. The scene cuts again, and the viewers are left wanting to see more. We don't get to see if the two of them actually have sex or not. We now see David and George sitting in a coffee shop together, and as usual, George is providing his opinion on David's clandestine rendezvous. George asks David why he must go after the young woman. He asks David if he really wants Consuela to go to her college friends and make fun of what it was like to have sex with such an old guy. David, however, thinks differently. He thinks it was a good experience between the two of them, and since David is her teacher and has discussed art and music with Consuela, then she'll remember him as a man with whom she had good sex, but also got to learn some culture. David smirks and giggles a little as he says this. George sees the immaturity in David's personality and tells him to stop worrying about growing old and start worrying about growing up, since David is still behaving like a 20-year-old when it comes to his sex life. George tells David to thank the gods for giving him one shot with a hot younger girl, but David gets serious and proudly claims that it wasn't just a one-time fling between them. George is stunned to hear this. He asks, "She came back for more?" Because he's shocked that a young 24-year-old girl like Consuela would want to have sex with an old man like David on a regular basis. The scene cuts to David and Consuela naked in bed. Consuela is on top of David, and their eyes are fixated on each other with an intense passion. Consuela is looking at David with a sense of nervous bemusement in her eyes, yet her posture confirms that she's very confident in herself and commands the situation with her sexual power. She's staring directly at David. They both hold each other's faces with their hands and passionately start to make out again. They're in bed now under the sheets, and Consuela asks David if he's had sex with a lot of women. He doesn't answer her directly, but tells her that he has been with many women, but it doesn't matter because right now he's only with her. He asks Consuela the same question, and she tells him she has not been with many men. David asks for the exact number, and Consuela tells him she has had 5 boyfriends during her life. David instantly seems to get pensive and jealous. As they get out of bed and Consuela is pouring herself a glass of wine, David starts to question her about these men. He's concerned that Consuela has been with men who are younger and more virile than him, and that maybe she has been more satisfied by those men. David is starting to get possessive. Over time, David and Consuela start to have sex more regularly, and while David wanted only sex, a relationship starts to develop between them. Every time Consuela tells David about a past sexual experience, David starts to get more and more jealous. It seems that he doesn't love Consuela, but in terms of sex, he wants Consuela's body all for himself, and doesn't want to think that Consuela was involved with any other men, even though David himself was involved with a lot of women in his life. While David is so concerned about Consuela's sexual virtues, he really does not hold the same standard for his own self. While he's involved with Consuela, he continues to have sex with Carolyn, the former student that he's known for 20 years, and they've been having sex regularly for all those 20 years. Despite what David wants, he can't help it that a serious connection is developing between him and Consuela. The relationship is becoming more than just sex, and with every passing day, David finds himself getting more and more possessive about Consuela. They walk on the beach together while Consuela opens up to David about her childhood. They hug each other as they walk on the beach, and as much as David wants to keep things strictly sexual, there's no denying now that a romantic connection is also developing, and David is starting to get attached to Consuela. During this romantic getaway, it's the first time that Consuela confesses to David that she's falling in love with him. David doesn't know how to react. His sexual desire trumps any emotions he feels in his heart, and he, at this point, is simply obsessed with being the only man that Consuela sleeps with. One time, Consuela is attending a dance party at a local club, and she's going with her young friends and her fellow students. She casually tells David about the occasion, but doesn't invite him because it's her time to enjoy with friends, away from David. However, David pulls up to the club in a cab while he knows Consuela is inside partying with her friends. He does not know how to deal with his emotions. He's never felt like this for any woman before, and he's almost getting obsessed with Consuela. David is there to secretly check up on her to see if she's cheating on him with a younger man. He walks into the club very nervously because there's no one inside who's of his age. The club is filled with young people who are there to drink, dance, and have fun with other young people. It's a Spanish club, and all the people are dancing to groovy salsa music. David's eyes are searching through the crowd, and he finally finds Consuela. She's wearing a sexy black dress and dancing with a young guy. At first, she doesn't see him because she's having fun dancing, but as soon as her dance comes to a stop, she sees David standing in the corner observing her. She's shocked and disappointed to see him there. He starts to walk towards her hastily, while Consuela throws her arms out in disbelief. David tries to make friendly small talk, but Consuela is distraught, and she asks David if he's there to check up on her because he's suspicious. She ends the discussion and tells him to start trusting her, and tells him that she'll call him when she wants to speak to him again. One day, David is hooking up with Carolyn, who doesn't know anything about Consuela and David's growing romance. Carolyn is confident that she's unique and valuable for David, which is why she's been having sex with him for 20 years. However, Carolyn is extremely shocked when she finds Consuela's tampon in David's bathroom. She instantly gets angry and starts to inquire about the tampon. She's mad that even though she gave David everything he wanted for 20 years, David still chose to have sex with another woman. David starts to act all innocent and tries to claim he doesn't know where the tampon came from. Carolyn tells David that she gave him what he wanted. She gave him just sex and then left till it was time to have sex again. She tells him that she's one in a million, and that there aren't a lot of other women like her who would give David just sex without a relationship or marriage for 20 years. David is too stunned to speak. His mind is looking for excuses. He tells her that George has keys to this apartment, and when David isn't home, George likes to bring over women to his apartment and have sex with them, because at his own house, his wife and children would catch him cheating. In order to get himself in clear water, David instantly defers all the blame onto George. Carolyn is still angry. She tells him that she doesn't believe even a single word of what David is telling her. David becomes emotional and tells her that Carolyn is all he has in his life, and that he's holding on to her desperately. Carolyn sits down and tries to calm herself down. She somewhat believes him. One day, David and Consuela are having dinner together. They haven't had any abrupt feelings or any arguments recently, and both of them are simply enjoying each other's company. This gives Consuela the idea to invite David to her graduation party. The class is ending now, and Consuela is hosting a party for all the students. David again feels uncomfortable with this proposal because the last time he saw Consuela at a party dancing with a young guy, it made him very upset, and his presence at the party made Consuela upset too. This is why he's unsure about attending the graduation party. He can see that Consuela notices his lack of enthusiasm for the invite. After a little bit of hesitation, he can't think of any excuse and finally agrees that he will attend the party. He is instantly overcome with internal dread as he starts thinking of ways to get out of the party. He is nervous, especially because Consuela's family will be at the party as well, and when Consuela will introduce David as her boyfriend, he fears that the family's reaction will be negative. When the day of the party finally comes, David calls Consuela and lies to her that he's stuck in extreme traffic and will be very late to the party, or might not even make it to the party in time. However, he's actually sitting in his car and he's not driving. He lies to Consuela because he can't help but feel extreme anxiety about meeting Consuela's family. Consuela knows he's lying, she hangs up the phone and they break up. While David is already suffering the heartbreak of losing Consuela, George suffers a stroke shortly afterward and passes away. David and George were at a poetry conference where George suffered a stroke. This massive loss makes him realize he can't lose Consuela too, and that he loves her. He goes on a tirade to correct all his wrongdoings. He tries to mend his relationship with his son Kenny. Kenny reveals that he's having an extramarital affair and that he is no better than David. After George's death, David spends 2 years alone before he gets to talk to Consuela again. He spends every day in existential dread. He doesn't know how to be himself or enjoy life without Consuela by his side. Finally, on New Year's Eve, David comes home from class one day and finds a message from Consuela on his answering machine. He is overcome with joy and relishes at the mere thought of getting to see Consuela again. He's happy but doesn't know that Consuela is hiding a deep, dark secret. In her voicemail, she tells David something important and drastic has happened to her, and she needs to tell David herself before he finds out from someone else. They agree to meet at David's apartment on a specific date. When David finally sees Consuela, his emotions are uncontrollable, and while he wants things to go back to normal, Consuela is here to tell him that things will never be the same as before. Consuela is overcome with emotion as she tells him that she has found a lump in her breast. David is flabbergasted to hear the news that someone so young and full of beauty has been struck by a life-threatening disease like breast cancer. Consuela tells him she'll need surgery to remove the lumps from her breasts, and that her breasts will never be the same again. David cries and cries, not finding a way to end his grief and sorrow about this dreadful news. He asks her why she took so long to tell him, but she doesn't have a reply. She's processing the entire thing herself, and didn't know when would be the right time to tell him. Consuela asks David to take pictures of her breasts before the doctors have to operate on them, and before surgeries ruin them. David agrees, and while he's still in a state of shock and grief, he starts to take pictures of her bare chest so he can permanently remember the most beautiful breasts that he's ever seen on a woman. In the final scene of the movie, we see David walking into the hospital where Consuela has now had her mastectomy surgery and she's recovering. The cancerous lump from her breasts has been removed successfully, but her breasts are now disfigured at an extremely young age, and she also fears the fact that cancer could come back. Consuela thinks that David will leave her or that she will die and leave him. She doesn't want to lose him and tells him that she'll miss him. David doesn't say much in return. He simply says, "I'm here," as he gently gets onto the hospital bed with her and starts to give her a tender kiss on her face. His gesture shows that he's fully committed to Consuela and does not want to lose her, no matter what the circumstances are. The movie ends with a flashback scene to the beach where Consuela was hugging David from behind and where she told him for the very first time that she loved him. To watch more recaps of these kinds of movies, click on the thumbnails on your screen. And don't forget to share your thoughts about today's video in the comments section. Kindly like the video and subscribe to my channel and press the bell icon so you don't miss any new videos. And at last I will say, stay safe, stay well, see you next time, and thanks for watching.